The moment that leaked palace memo surfaced, everything changed. Because this was no longer just another whisper about tension between brothers. This was an accusation so explosive that it threatened to rip through the very spine of the monarchy itself. A claim that Prince William had quietly initiated a private bloodline verification panel targeting Harry's children. A move so calculated, so clinical, and so devastating in implication that it sent shockwaves from London to California before the ink on the memo had even metaphorically dried. And just like that, the storm began. Not with a public announcement, not with a balcony appearance, not with a polished palace statement, but with a leak. The kind of leak that feels intentional, strategic, almost surgical. Because insiders insist this memo did not slip out accidentally. It emerged at the precise moment when internal tensions had reached a boiling point, when quiet meetings inside Buckingham Palace had turned from routine constitutional housekeeping into something far darker, something far more personal. And at the center of it all stood William, the future king, allegedly greenlighting a confidential panel whose sole purpose was to re-examine, re-verify, and re-scrutinize the bloodline credentials of Archie and Lilibet. According to whispers circulating through royal corridors, what began as a standard archival review, a dry, bureaucratic process ahead of broader constitutional reforms, slowly transformed into a forensic examination of records tied directly to Harry's children, and the shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, until one particular folder reportedly caught William's attention. A file that should have been routine, but instead appeared riddled with procedural anomalies, missing confirmations, unusual deviations from long-standing royal medical protocol. And it was in that moment. Sources say that something inside him hardened, because for William, legitimacy is not symbolic, it is structural. It is the load-bearing pillar of the crown, and even the slightest crack in that pillar could one day become a collapse heard around the world. Those close to the situation describe the atmosphere inside the palace as tense but controlled. Not chaotic, not emotional, but chillingly methodical. With legal advisors summoned quietly, constitutional experts consulted behind closed doors, and a discreet advisory group formed under the pretext of succession integrity review, a phrase so bland it almost disguises the nuclear implication beneath it. Because if the memo is to be believed, this was not about gossip or rivalry. It was about establishing a private bloodline verification panel, a phrase that carries the weight of centuries of dynastic paranoia, of ancient fears about substitution, surrogacy, undisclosed procedures, and the sacred requirement that those in the line of succession must be unquestionably, verifiably, beyond any shadow of doubt, born of royal blood under recognized protocol. Inside those stone walls, conversations reportedly turned clinical, with documents laid out across long oak tables, timelines compared, physician signatures scrutinized, overseas birth registrations cross-checked against sovereign oversight standards, and while no public accusation was ever made, the very act of forming such a panel sent a message louder than any speech ever could. Because to question the documentation tied to Harry's children is to question the narrative that has been publicly accepted since their births. And to do so quietly, internally, without announcement suggests that William was not looking for spectacle, he was looking for certainty. But here is where the story shifts from procedural to personal, because the memo allegedly confirms that William did not initially inform Harry of the panel's formation, a decision that insiders claim was deliberate, not out of cruelty, but out of caution. Because once the words verification and bloodline enter a conversation, the emotional fallout becomes uncontrollable, and so instead of a brotherly call, there was a controlled review. Instead of a confrontation, there was documentation, and when Harry eventually became aware of what was unfolding, it was not through a warm family briefing, but through the cold realization that his children's status was being quietly re-examined by the very institution he once served. Across the Atlantic, sources describe an immediate defensive posture from Meghan's camp. Legal teams activated, privacy arguments prepared, the narrative reframed as harassment, intrusion, discrimination, and yet inside palace circles the language remained rigidly formal, focused not on personalities but on protocol, not on feelings but on constitutional compliance. compliance. Because if the monarchy is anything, it is procedural, and procedure can be weaponized without ever raising a voice. Those who defend William insist this was inevitable, that modern complexities, international births, private medical teams, non-traditional arrangements have forced the monarchy to update its internal safeguards, that a private panel was simply an overdue audit in an era where optics and authenticity must align perfectly. And yet critics argue that the timing feels too pointed, too convenient, emerging just as public tensions between the brothers had begun to resurface in subtle but unmistakable ways, suggesting that this was not merely administrative but strategic, a preemptive move to secure the throne against any future uncertainty, even if that meant deepening the fracture within his own family. Imagine the weight of that decision, the calculation behind it, because forming such a panel is not impulsive. It requires legal drafting, advisory consensus, and at least tacit approval from the highest levels. And while no official decree has been released, the leaked memo implies that William was prepared to follow the findings wherever they led, whether that meant quiet confirmation and closure, or something far more destabilizing. And it is this readiness, this willingness to confront even the possibility of scandal within his own bloodline that has left observers divided between those who see a ruthless guardian of the crown and those who see a brother turning constitutional machinery against his nephew and niece. Inside California, the emotional stakes reportedly soared, because to hear that a bloodline verification panel is reviewing your children's documentation is to feel accused without being formally accused. And insiders suggest that Meghan interpreted the move not as neutral compliance, but as targeted suspicion, as though the palace had never truly trusted her. And whether that perception is fair or not, it has intensified the already fragile dynamic between the Sussex household and the institution they left behind. What makes this development so combustible is not just the content of the memo, but the symbolism of it, because bloodline has always been the monarchy's most sacred currency, and to audit it is to signal that nothing is immune from scrutiny, not even the grandchildren of a reigning king. And if William is indeed willing to authorize such a review, it reveals a future monarch prepared to prioritize institutional purity over personal comfort, over familial peace, over the optics of unity. As palace staff reportedly moved through corridors with measured urgency, as advisors debated thresholds for evidence, as legal language was refined to avoid direct accusation while still allowing full investigation, the unspoken truth hovered over every conversation. Once this door is opened, it cannot easily be closed, because even if the panel ultimately confirms everything beyond question, the mere existence of the review plants doubt in the public imagination, and doubt, once seated, spreads faster than any official statement can contain. And so the monarchy finds itself suspended in a delicate balance, with a leaked memo igniting global headlines, with William portrayed either as a principled reformer or a calculating strategist, with Harry caught between loyalty to his children and fury at the implication, and with Meghan reportedly refusing to engage without ironclad guarantees, turning what may have begun as a quiet internal review into a transatlantic standoff that threatens to redefine the boundaries between private family matters and constitutional obligation. The question now is not merely whether the panel exists, but what it represents. Because if this is a future of royal governance, audits, verifications, uncompromising scrutiny, then the era of sentimental leniency is over, replaced by a colder, more procedural monarchy under William's shadow. And as the memo continues to circulate, dissected line by commentators and insiders alike, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The bloodline is no longer just heritage, it is evidence, and evidence demands examination. And if the first tremor was the leak itself, the real earthquake began in the silence that followed. Because what the public did not see were the nights of closed-door consultations, the private exchanges routed through legal intermediaries, and the slow, suffocating realization inside both households that this was no longer a rumor to be laughed off or dismissed as tabloid fantasy. It was a structural confrontation unfolding beneath layers of protocol, and the deeper it went, the harder it became to separate duty from strategy, protection from punishment, reform from revenge. Insiders claim that once the private Bloodline verification panel was formally assembled, its mandate was outlined in language so neutral it almost felt cruel in its precision, stating that its purpose was to ensure full constitutional compliance and documentation alignment for all individuals. Within the direct line of succession, a sentence that never names Harry's children yet leaves no doubt about who stands at the center of its scrutiny. And within that phrasing lies the brilliance or brutality of the move, depending on which side one believes. Because by avoiding direct accusation, the palace shielded itself from claims of personal attack while simultaneously signaling that nothing about this review was casual. Within palace walls, members of the advisory circle reportedly debated how far the panel should extend its authority, whether it could request supplemental documentation, whether it could mandate third-party verification, whether it could operate under updated succession standards that account for international births and private medical arrangements. And as those debates intensified, William is said to have maintained a posture of icy restraint, insisting that the objective was not exclusion but insulation, not humiliation but clarity, and yet even those sympathetic to his position admit that clarity in matters of bloodline has historically been a double-edged sword, because once scrutiny begins, it invites speculation, and speculation rarely confines itself to facts. Across the Atlantic, the Sussex household reportedly shifted into crisis mode, not because any formal charge had been leveled, but because the existence of the panel itself suggested that trust had eroded to a point of no return. And sources close to Meghan describe a woman furious not only at the insinuation, but at the audacity of conducting such a review without first seeking cooperative dialogue, interpreting it as a calculated maneuver designed to corner her publicly while maintaining plausible deniability, and whether that interpretation reflects reality or emotion, it has fueled a narrative that William's reformist posture masks a deeper determination to redraw the boundaries of succession in ways that permanently curtail the influence of his brother's branch of the family. Meanwhile, Harry is said to have found himself in a psychological vice, caught between outrage and uncertainty, because while his instinct may be to defend his children without hesitation, the procedural framing of the panel leaves little room for emotional rebuttal, reducing the matter to paperwork, signatures, timestamps, and compliance standards. And in that sterile arena, feelings carry no weight, only documentation does. And those who know him suggest that what unsettles him most is not the investigation itself, but the implication that his word alone is insufficient, that the institution he once trusted to honor family bonds now demands institutional proof in place of fraternal faith. The tension escalated when legal representatives reportedly exchanged drafts outlining potential next steps should the panel determine that supplemental verification is required. And while no conclusion has been publicly announced, the mere preparation of contingency plans indicates that the Palace is ready for every scenario, from quiet confirmation that resolves the matter discreetly to a far more dramatic recalibration of succession status that would send headlines spiraling worldwide. In London, commentators have begun speculating that this development signals the dawn of a colder monarchy under William's eventual reign, one less concerned with preserving the illusion of harmony and more committed to codifying every vulnerability before it can metastasize into scandal. And some royal traditionalists applaud this approach as overdue modernization, arguing that in an era of global media scrutiny, the crown cannot afford even the faintest procedural ambiguity, while critics warn that such rigidity risks alienating not only estranged family members, but a public increasingly weary of internal royal strife masquerading as constitutional necessity. This symbolism of the situation grows heavier with each passing day, because at its core, this is is not simply about paperwork, but about power, about who defines legitimacy, about whether birthright is self-evident or institutionally certified, and the leaked memo has transformed what might have. Remained an internal audit into a public referendum on how far a future king is willing to go to fortify his inheritance. Behind closed doors, the strategic calculations reportedly continue, with advisors assessing public reaction models, legal ramifications, and international diplomatic optics, because any overt move to adjust the line of succession would ripple far beyond Britain, affecting Commonwealth narratives and reinforcing perceptions of division at the very top of the House of Windsor. And yet the longer the panel operates in silence, the more speculation swells, creating a paradox in which secrecy fuels precisely the instability it seeks to prevent. There are whispers that William has privately conveyed to senior figures that the monarchy must be future-proofed against uncertainty, a phrase that carries both pragmatism and menace, because future-proofing can mean strengthening foundations, but it can also mean trimming branches deemed too unpredictable. And if the Sussex children are perceived as potential flashpoints in future constitutional debates, then this panel may represent the first step in redefining their role before such debates erupt publicly. What makes the narrative so combustible is the emotional undercurrent that refuses to disappear, because beneath the language of compliance and verification lies the raw reality of two brothers whose relationship has been strained by years of mistrust, and to insert a bloodline audit into that already fractured dynamic feels less like routine governance and more like a final test of allegiance, a declaration that the crown's continuity supersedes personal reconciliation, and insiders insist that William understands the human cost of this decision, yet believes that postponing clarity would only amplify future damage, reasoning that it is better to endure a controlled controversy now than a catastrophic revelation later. As speculation intensifies, one haunting question lingers in every royal conversation. If the panel ultimately confirms full compliance, will the damage to family bonds be repairable, or has the act of verification itself permanently altered the landscape of trust? And conversely, if the panel uncovers irregularities requiring formal adjustment, how will the monarchy manage the fallout without appearing vindictive or reactionary? And it is within these unresolved possibilities that the true drama resides, because regardless of outcome, the mere willingness to initiate such a panel signals a transformative moment in royal governance, one where sentiment yields to scrutiny and where even the youngest members of the dynasty are not insulated from institutional review. For now, the leaked memo continues to circulate like a phantom document, dissected by analysts, debated by insiders, denied by official spokespeople who neither confirm nor categorically refute its contents, and in that ambiguity, the story thrives, because ambiguity invites imagination, and imagination in matters of monarchy can be as destabilizing as fact, and so the world watches as William's alleged private bloodline verification panel operates in the shadows, a quiet mechanism with potentially thunderous consequences, reshaping not only the future of Harry's children, but the very definition of how the crown safeguards its lineage in an age where secrecy is fragile and loyalty is conditional.